I'm Laura Krentz. I have many interests. Among them are puppetry and history. So tonight we have two of my interest groups getting together for, well, maybe the second time. I think we did 2011 or so, we did a joint program. So anyway, I just want to introduce Kurt Hunter, who is the vice president of our Puppetry Guild currently. And then we will be introducing Jennings and our wonderful program for tonight.
A little bit of playing tag here. Thank you, Laura. I just want to highlight a little bit about the Twin City Puppeteers. The guild goes back to the early part of the 20th century. You'll learn more about that as the evening goes on. I don't want to spoil any of it for you. But if you haven't had a chance, we've got an exhibit of some historic puppets back in the back of the room. The scrapbook of the guild is in the back of the room if you want to flip through some of that. The next event the Guild has coming up, we're partnering with Heart of the Beast because World Puppetry Day is March 21st. It's an event sponsored by the International Organization of Puppeteers, as well as the Puppeteers of America. And also, if you're interested, if this spurs your interest in puppetry, we have an email list that sends out messages once or twice a month. This will be on the back table as well if you want to sign up. There's a QR code where you can jump to an online form. Easier, more accurate way to enter your email address. But don't want to delay things any further. This is going to be a very exciting program. Jennings has done a really marvelous deep dive into the history of puppetry in this area and discovered lots of things that some of us who have been around for a long time had no idea about with all of the various historic sources that they've found. So I'm going to give it right over to Jennings.
So much, Kurt, and thank you all for being here. I would like to introduce... No, I'm just kidding. My name is Jennings, and I will be talking to you this evening about the history of puppetry in the Twin Cities, what it looked like, and some ideas on how it got to be here. But first, we need to look at some terms. So, what is a puppet? Puppetry didn't emerge from a single source, and obviously it takes a very wide variety of forms. There are hand puppets, there are marionettes. Those are two kinds that you can see in the back. There's a variety of international forms of puppetry, things that have been developed quite recently, things that are quite traditional, things that rely on newer technology, things that rely on older technology, a number of different things. But how do we cohere that into sort of something manageable that we can discuss? So the working definition we are going to use for the evening is that a puppet is an inanimate object animated through performance such that the audience believes it's alive. As you can tell, very scientific, but the more intellectual debate of is this used car dealership thing a puppet is a topic for another evening beyond the scope of tonight's presentation. But there's another part of the definition as well. A puppet, for our purposes, should probably be animated by someone who thinks of themselves as a puppeteer. Now, puppeteers were invented in 1912. Obviously, people were manipulating puppets before then, but the term puppeteer itself was coined by Ellen van Valkenburg, who, along with her then husband, Maurice Brown, co-founded the Little Theater movement in Chicago. Before this, a person who manipulated a puppet was called, at least in English, a puppet player, a term that emerged in the 1500s. A puppet master, the manager of a puppet show, a term which emerged in the 1600s, and occasionally a puppetman, which is fun. But Ellen van Valkenburg wanted to redefine the role of the person behind the puppet, with the puppeteer being one who handles a puppet, much as a muleteer handles a mule, or a soldier is armed with a musket, is a musketeer. So now that we have an understanding of terms, let's go over what we're not talking about tonight. There is a rich and extensive history of puppets globally. No one culture has a particular monopoly on puppetry. So when we talk for tonight's presentation about where puppets come from, I'm not really talking about who brought an existing coherent tradition of puppetry from Europe or elsewhere to here. We're not, we're talking a little bit beyond, who did the first Punch and Judy show here. Similarly, This is not to discount the rich history or indeed the rich present of indigenous puppetry in the Americas, including Dakota and Ojibwe forms of puppetry performance that happened here. And while there are still indigenous puppeteers here performing today, the community of puppeteers as a whole doesn't trace a consistent lineage through from indigenous puppeteers to the community today because of result of colonization and cultural persecution. Here are two example forms of indigenous puppetry. The one on the left is a shaman puppet from the Diomede Island in Alaska made around 1880, and then the one on the right is an orca mask from a Kwakwaka'wakw mask dance in 1904 or so. Both of these things might look to us like puppetry, but we can't say for sure that the person who was doing them conceptualized themselves as a puppeteer. So we'll get more into that in a sec. But because there's sort of a historic gray area in assigning modern terminology to past actors if the terminology that if it's not terminology that they themselves would have used. We can't necessarily look at something that happened before the emergence of the term puppeteer and go, that is puppetry, and the person doing it thinks of themselves as a puppeteer. And while I don't think we should be constrained entirely in our discussion by the terminology someone used at the time, I think it is worth sort of a nuanced conversation. So I don't feel like I can necessarily look at either of these two performances depicted and go, this is definitively a puppeteer and the person doing it thinks of themselves that way, because there are other ways that they could have constructed their identities without this term, as an actor, as a jester, as a historian, as a cultural storyteller, as a participator in a religious ceremony, in ways that don't necessarily map onto what we think of as a puppeteer today. So, now that we know what a puppet is and what a puppeteer is, and that by where did puppetry in the Twin Cities come from, what we're really asking is, where did performers who self-conceptualized as puppeteers come to be in the Twin Cities in the period beginning in the 1910s? You can see why I didn't make that the title. Now, one of the challenges in doing this research is that puppetry is a very visual art form. Reading the script of a puppet show is different from seeing a picture of it, which is very different from seeing the puppets themselves performed. And it's also not generally considered a fine art, so it's not often taken seriously artistically and documented in full. So most of the puppet shows that have happened don't end up photographed, most of the puppets don't survive, and the photographs that do survive don't necessarily end up in archives. A number of the archives across the Twin Cities do have small collections of puppet-related images, but these can be difficult to find, and you sort of have to know what you're looking for in order to find it. And that is why in some of the pieces of the presentation, there will be very rich, in-depth, nuanced depictions of lots of pictures, lots of images that you can look at. And for other ones, I will have one picture up while I just sort of talk, because not all of the information that I would love to show to you has survived to be displayed in the present day. Great, now that we're 10 minutes in, when am I going to get to the point? Soon. But first, I think comparative history is interesting, and you're all here to hear me talk, so now you're going to have to pretend that comparative history is also interesting for a few minutes. So what does the entertainment environment look like in 1910 in the context that puppetry emerges from? We'll say that you're a child in 1920. We'll say that you live in Minneapolis. This is not a picture from 1920. This is a picture from the 1949 movie The Great Gatsby, which is set in the 20s, because it was really difficult to find a New Year's picture from 1920. Anyway, so you're a child, you live in Minneapolis. What does your entertainment environment look like? The radio, it looks like this. You don't have one. And even if you did have one, it wouldn't matter because there are no radio stations in Minnesota in 1920. The phonograph, you probably don't have one either, unless you're very, very rich. There were about 7,000 phonographs in the US at this point. Most phonographs still used cylinders rather than discs, and those were more common, but those were quite expensive. You probably get the newspaper. Yeah, we love the newspaper. Since it's a city paper, it probably comes twice a day. It probably has some comics in it. You're a kid, you probably like comics. The hottest new comic book character is Barney Google with his googly eyes. That's a joke for maybe 2 people. If you have some spending money, you can go take the streetcar, which costs 6 cents, to go see a movie, which costs maybe 5 to 10 cents. Inside the movie, there's someone playing a big organ. There is not synchronized sound. You go to the movie, you see a newsreel, you see a cartoon. Maybe it's that new fellow, Felix the Cat. We all know Felix the Cat. You see a silent film, you're a kid, so you probably like Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin, or if you're a weird kid, you like Lon Chaney. You probably like to read. If you're reading, you might be reading Westerns. Zane Grey is very popular. Anne of Green Gables is also very popular. Or if you're sort of a bad kid, you like Captain Billy's Whiz Bang. You've probably gone to some school. You may have dropped out to work, but you're probably going to school until 7th or 8th grade at the latest. Maybe high school if you're particularly well off, probably not college. The adults in your life can probably read at a basic level, but probably didn't themselves go much beyond junior high. They may not be able to read in English. It's not unlikely in Minneapolis at the time that your parents immigrated and you speak another language at home, probably Norwegian or Swedish or German, and that may well have been your first language too. If you have a brother or a father, he probably just came back from the Great War. And also you've just had Spanish flu. But there's good news. You probably have sewers. And if you don't have sewers, you'll probably have them quite soon. Isn't that exciting? Anyway, so that's the general cultural environment. We'll say, continuing our sort of framing device, you live near a park because everyone in Minneapolis lives near a park. They designed the city that way. Anyway, there's a lady in this park, and she asks you if you'd like to be part of the upcoming park pageant. Her name is Alice Dietz, and Minneapolis began these park pageants in 1918. From 1918 to 1920, they were directed by a high school teacher, Julia Beckham. But from 1920 onward, Alice Dietz, an employee of the park board, wrote original scripts or adapted fairy tales. These pageants would go on to feature more than 1,000 costumed children in a performance in the Rose Garden in Lindale Park. And so this is a picture from the 1918 one. You can see a lot of children in their little costumes. I believe this was based on a Mother Goose rhyme. And now one of the photographs from this era is actually quite fascinating because while you sometimes get pictures of the performers like this, you very rarely get photographs of the audience. So this is the audience for one of the shows in 1937. The shows were often 1 or 2 nights and could get crowds of up to 40,000 people in total. That's 10% of Minneapolis at the time. So, yeah, there's so many people here. Dietz had a background in dance and performance, and year-round was a park supervisor in Logan Park, where she oversaw recreational programming. The format of the pageants was quite organized. Neighborhood children would represent a particular park and would be dressed in particular costumes for their roles. This one is from 1925. The children from your park probably have some sort of themed outfit. Maybe you're all bears. When it's your turn in the pageant, you come in, you do a little dance, you promenade, whatever. And then you leave, and then the people from the next park come in, feeding into an overall narrative structure. In her first year, in 1921, Dietz requested from the park board, and it was granted, the ability to retain the copyright for her scripts that she wrote. It doesn't seem like she did anything public with them, and their modern whereabouts are not known. But if you know where they are, you want to tell me? So, variety of pictures from the pageant, courtesy of the Minnesota Digital Library, which has them. Also, the Minneapolis Park Board year-end reports would often feature. And here's this year's park pageant. The only year the pageant didn't happen following 1918 was in 1932 because of the Depression. And the only year that they reused a previous show was in 1939 when they redid the show from 1922. The Park Board report from that year noted that many of the children from the 1922 show were returning as the parents of new children in the 1939 show. We don't actually have any pictures of the 1939 show itself, but we do have a picture of Alice Dietz from this show. This picture and much of the research from this is from David C. Smith's blog, Minneapolis Park History, which is really wonderful. He wrote about Alice Dietz, and one of his viewers in 2014 wrote back, "I remember this. I was in the 1939 park pageant. This is a picture of me in it," which is wonderful. So this is Alice Dietz and Beatrice Dunlap in the 1939 pageant. The final year of the pageants was in 1941. And following that following year, 1942, it was incorporated as a part of the Aquatennial, and sort of didn't maintain its identity as an independent event. Alice Dietz retired in 1957. This is about 1957, and then died in about 1977. I believe there were 5 other people also named Alice Dietz who lived in Minneapolis at about the same time. Now, real question. Is this puppetry? According to our earlier definition, but structurally, I think it does have important similarities to things like Mayday or Bare Bones. Large outdoor-style puppetry that is deeply participatory, happens annually, seasonally, has a generational component. While it might not be a puppet show by our formal definition, I think it draws a strong analog. Here's the 1937 crowd. Here's Mayday last year in a picture that I took. I didn't take a picture of the actual performance. I took a picture of the crowd because I'm a historian. So part of having a thriving puppet culture like we do is not just having artists who are trained and interested, but having audiences who are trained and interested and will keep showing up to see puppetry. So let's return to our framing device. As a child in the 20s, you really enjoyed being a part of this pageant, maybe even for several years. But now, it's 1930. It's New Year's, 1930. I found a picture of that. I was very pleased. What does your life look like? The radio. You probably have one. I mean, like 50-50. About half of homes in Minnesota had radios in 1930. You might catch new shows, like the Fleischmann's Yeast Hour, starring Rudy Valley. That's one of the most popular shows on the radio in 1930. You might still take the streetcar, but you notice a lot fewer people are riding on it. Ridership is about half of what it was 10 years ago. You probably still get the newspaper twice a day. Now they have comics like Little Orphan Annie. You can also read Tarzan novels. You can read Buck Rogers. The new character in the papers is Popeye. There's also more to read now. You can read Newbery Award-winning books have been invented. You could read Dr. Dolittle. You could read Gay Neck, The Story of a Pigeon. That won the Newbery Award in late 1920s. That's exciting. You go to see a movie, and now there's sound. It's been recent. It's been very big. The cartoons have gotten better with sound, too. You're probably seeing Oswald the Lucky Rabbit or Mickey Mouse. They look kind of similar, don't they? I wouldn't worry about that too much. Walt Disney sure didn't. And also your life has gotten worse. The economy has collapsed. You're probably not starving, but your quality of life has deteriorated pretty quickly. One day you're reading the paper, and because you still get the paper, and you see someone about your age. Her name is Virginia Upson, and she is doing a lot of puppetry around town. So Virginia was born in 1908, so she is about the same age as you, the hypothetical child in this framing device. She moved around a lot as a child, but was in and out of the Twin Cities quite frequently. This is her high school graduation photo. And in 1924, she went to a Girl Scouts trip to Lake Okoboji in Iowa. It was at this camp that she saw a marionette performance for the first time from a counselor named Margaret Skewis. Some of you recognize that name, but I think most of you would recognize one of her later creations, Howdy Doody. Anyway, so the young Virginia was very deeply, profoundly taken by puppets, and when she got home, she started making a puppet immediately. It was about 6 inches tall. She sliced her thumb making it. She was okay. But she continued to make marionettes. She spent the day rehearsing. She made them in school. She started performing them. And after graduation, she took a community education class on puppetry. And following that, she began to perform on her own. So she, after making dozens, if not hundreds of puppets, she performed them all around. This is one of her first shows for the Ramsey County Health Association about nutrition. This is a bottle of milk. It's a little bottle of milk marionette, and he teaches all of the children about how they should drink him. That's fun. She this is a picture of her performing marionettes for a show for the Hennepin County Tuberculosis Association. Because at this point, there is radio as an informational and educational tool, but if you want to create something dynamic and engaging for children, that is visually engaging especially, you hire a puppeteer and you send them out and you have them perform. She made particularly good money performing at the Emporium department store in St. Paul during the lead up to the Christmas season. I moved my pictures around. Some more pictures of her and her puppets. There's some of her puppets back there as well. But at the Emporium, she did a show in the window. She did 5 shows a day, 7 days a week, and it made her $250, which is about $5,000 today. She also took up a job, if the papers are to be believed, as a part-time window washer to strengthen her arms to aid her in performance. I can't tell if this was a joke, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. Virginia kept performing throughout the 30s, and we will catch up with her later. But before we get too far into the future, let's briefly return to our framing device. So the economy. There isn't one. It's collapsed. You want to help support your family, but nobody is hiring because nobody has money. And then one day, your president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, invents something called the Works Progress Administration. If you don't have any money, you show up, they tell you to do something, and you get paid. So you, the hypothetical person in this framing device, show up, and you get sent to a drafty warehouse in Minneapolis, and your job is now to make puppets. Your trainer and supervisor is a woman named Deborah Meter, and the government is paying you to make puppets? How did this happen? Well, let's take a look at Deborah Meter. So in the late 1920s, her husband had an accident that left him unable to work, and while her daughter was also ill with scarlet fever, Meter went to the library in St. Paul to look for books on puppetry. The only book on puppet making she could find was in Italian, so she had it translated, and then she started making puppets. She was soon a staple of the fashionable Summit Avenue children's birthday parties with her little puppets, and she had figured out not just production, but mass production. The Deborah Meter Puppet Shop sold theaters, puppets, there's some of them in the back, stages, and scripts. She had several patents on stages. And the stages were fabricated by her husband and then her father, who moved in with them. And so here are some of her puppets. This is not her patented stage. This is a different stage, but she did design this. She designed a whole variety of things. She became particularly involved, like Virginia Upson, in puppets as public health performance. The National Dairy Council was particularly keen on introducing puppets as a tool. Remember, at this point, 50-50 odds that you have a radio. Advertising, it's on the radio, it's on the streetcars, it's in the papers, but you want something engaging to sell your milk to the children, or rather to their parents. So the show Deborah Meter performed for the Dairy Conference does not have any known surviving photographs, but it does have a description from an essay written by her granddaughter. Why the cow jumped over the moon tells the trouble in Mother Goose Land that erupts when there is no milk because the cow has jumped over the moon. The most unfortunate character in the play is the crooked man, who develops crooked bones and teeth because he is unable to find milk to drink. Meader commented on the experience briefly in an article, quote, "The National Dairy Council was one of the first to recognize puppets' adaptability to propaganda." Many of her other shows were focused on public service messages as well. She had one commissioned by the Iowa Bureau of Dental Hygiene that has a character named Mr. Tooth, who teaches people how to take better care of him. She also did a lot of shows and classes in churches and for summer camps and at a municipal recreation conference. She made pretty good money from her stage patents and manufacturing, and she had enough income from her work to move her family into a larger house with an in-house workshop. But in the 1930s, the Depression, her husband's ongoing illness, and an accident that left her daughter blind in one eye had eaten through most of her savings. And that is when Meader, like many Americans, got relief from the New Deal's unemployment program. The structure of the program, the structure of the New Deal is Byzantine and complicated, and I won't get into it in super great detail, but there were a succession of New Deal-era programs that she was involved with. The first one was called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, where she traveled around the state and she did 3-day workshops on puppet creation, a lot of work for state hospitals, for settlement houses, for prisons, and it was very impactful. She estimated about 1,000 people a week were making puppets in Minnesota as a part of this program. At the same time, she was employed by the Civil Works Administration, which is another parallel New Deal program, as a supervisor, and this is how she described her work again in an interview with her granddaughter. "The word went out to put people on the program more or less helter-skelter. There was no time to sort them out or to get projects set up. What they needed to do was get a paycheck in the hands of the head of the household to prime the pump, to get things started in the other direction. People had to go to relief associations and get certified for relief. There was a cursory interview. All those who couldn't name a special skill were put in the 2 catch-all projects. The women whom I worked with were in sewing. There were a great bunch of women in the sewing project and a great bunch of men working the road crews. And the women who sewed largely sewed costumes for puppets." So both of these programs had ended by 1935, and that was when, after learning from some of these past mistakes, the Roosevelt administration created the WPA. This is a picture of a WPA instructor, Bernard Rupert, going out into the classroom, showing children how to make puppets. Now, some people questioned why funding was being set aside to employ artists to make puppets. The response of WPA director Harry Hopkins was, "Hell, artists have to eat just like other people." And so the government hired people and put them to work making puppets. Now, before we move on, this one is actually from a WPA puppetry group in Washington, D.C. There were about 20 puppetry groups nationwide. I bring this up to expand it beyond Minnesota and contextualize it, also because out of the New York Puppetry WPA, we get these really delightful audience pictures of children seeing a puppet show. This is why I brought up the whole extended piece about what the entertainment experience was like of a child in the 20s and the 30s, because that is the experience of these children who are going to see a puppet show. That is what you are seeing on those faces. These children have only probably had radio for 2 years. Now, a brief note on the structure. The Minnesota WPA had 5 divisions. One of these divisions was the Division of Women's and Professional Projects. Meader worked for the Recreation Department within this division. The Recreation Department oversaw drama, athletics, art, music, and puppetry. Deborah Meader was the director of puppetry for the state of Minnesota. This largely meant performance of puppetry, but not exclusively, because there was another division, the Division of Handicrafts and Toys, and they were tasked with making the puppets, also under the informal direction of Meader. They made the puppets that would then later be performed by the puppet troops that Meader also coordinated. It took a lot of research to piece this out and to make it intelligible. So let's look at some of those puppets that they made. These were for Ivanhoe. in 1935 or so. These are from the Minnesota Historical Society. They have a set of about 10 hand puppets used for Ivanhoe. This is Deborah Meader demonstrating shadow puppetry to some children. She actually didn't know about shadow puppetry when she started. She learned about it in the early 30s and then worked hard to integrate it both into the WPA curriculum and also into some of her previous shows and stages. Gesundheit. This is one of my favorite photos that I found in this project. A lot of people think that this photo is me. It's not. This is from 1937. And anyway, I had a different haircut. These ones are also particularly interesting. These are marionettes that were developed as a part of the show called The Creation of the World. And I think this is another really good example of this sort of synthesis and intersections between New Deal programs. So the show Creation of the World is an Ojibwe creation story. It was recorded in an interview by someone working for another WPA program, the Federal Writers Project, who went to Ojibwe reservations in northern Minnesota to do oral histories with elders. They heard the story, they recorded it, they wrote it down, and then Deborah Meader took the written down story and adapted it into a stage play. The puppets from these designs were carved by the handicraft department, and they were outfitted with little beaded outfits by Ojibwe artists who were working for the WPA, also as a part of the handicrafts division. I think that is what makes particularly the center and right puppets most interesting, is they aren't dressed in a general or ambiguous native style. Those are very specifically Ojibwe beaded florals. And it's interesting to see that come through in an era where, many other puppets did not have this particular intersection or informed point of creation. The show was first performed publicly at the State Fair in 1937. There was a dance done before the play that we have pictures of. We have a picture of the stage that says, you can come see the creation of the world here. We cannot see the picture of the presentation itself, which is unfortunate. I have read the script. It is at the Historical Society, and I will say to everyone's credit that it is much less racist than I thought it was going to be. A lot of other WPA puppets were debuted at the fair as well, and the fact that a lot of the fabrication and training was within the women's division explains why a lot of these pictures performing and holding the puppets are women. This is also another picture that I particularly enjoy of students who have been trained to perform. And look at that kid in the middle. He knows there's a photo being taken. And so these are some other of the puppets that debuted at the fair with, we're not super clear on the relationship of the people holding the puppets to the puppets themselves. But another one of the WPA projects was the Workers' Education Puppet Troupe. This is the only known photograph from one of their shows, but they started as a puppet troupe performing at union events about labor politics, and then they grew into the St. Paul Labor College, which is wild. And a number of the newspaper accounts in the late 30s and early 40s talk about, oh yes, we all know how the St. Paul Labor College started as a puppet show, whatever. It's barely even worth repeating. So as a supervisor, Deborah Meader trained 36 teachers in puppet instruction, and in turn, they trained about 900 leaders who would go out into communities and train adults and children in puppet performance and construction. Some of her notes explain the qualities to look for in a puppet leader. They must have interest and enthusiasm, they must have patience, and they must have an interest constantly reinforced by ongoing learning. She was very, very interested in the educational aspect of this and felt that, you didn't need to know everything coming in, but you needed to want to continue to learn and sort of better your performance and your teaching. She was also interested in their integration in puppetry, of sort of psychology and educational principles in puppetry. Here she is with Mrs. Ray Druck, who is a notable child psychologist in Minnesota in the 30s. For her part of her passion seems to be about the egalitarianism of puppetry. She noted that puppetry was very transformative for shy or disabled children because it allowed them to perform without becoming themselves the object of spectacle. And another one of her very fervent beliefs was the idea that puppetry as an inherently collaborative art form would build people's ability to work together, and this would inherently push back against the relentless individualism of fascism. She took a very pointed and explicit anti-fascist approach in her work of, this is teaching people how to collaborate. This is how we will win the war, not on the battlefield, but psychologically. She also taught periodic classes at the University of Minnesota, and her notes and syllabi survive. Her class included, among other things, a midterm examination. I have some of the questions here from the true or false section. So I will read through them, and if you would be so kind as to shout out whether you think these are false or true, we'll see if you pass. Number 1, marionettes are operated from above with strings. Excellent. Cooperation is developed in giving a puppet play. Yes, very good. Shy children are released from self-consciousness by the protection afforded by the puppet screen. Yes. And finally, group action is the foundation of fascism. Correct. Good job, everyone. You all pass a University of Minnesota extension course in 1939. If you got all of them right, you can stay after the presentation and clean the erasers or something. Anyway, the puppetry aspect of the WPA was axed in 1939. Again, a piece from Meter's interview with her granddaughter. We were one of the departments to be picked on for boondoggling, as they called it. They'd say, puppets, of all the things to teach adults. Adult education and recreation was a completely new idea, and besides, the Republicans and anti-New Deal people were usually always critical. I think we accomplished a great deal, and there was a tremendous growth through adult education. The people we had in the recreation department had excellent training. There was money for doing something, and that something they learned better and better. So after the Republicans and anti-New Deal people, as Meter called them, they were the Dyes Committee, chaired by Martin Dyes, and his committee was a precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. They got the Federal Theater Project closed down because of fears of subversive socialist influences. Meter and her family moved to Cincinnati, where she taught at a private school, and then later moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where she passed away in 1980. So, now, we have an audience for puppetry that has been building for a little over 20 years. We have a group of people who took to puppetry all on their own, like Virginia Upson and others. We even have people employed by the government professionally to make and perform puppets. So what does all this culminate into? Well, Alexis de Tocqueville observed that Americans have an almost pathological desire to join associations. And by God, that's just what they did. So the national organization, Puppeteers of America, was founded in 1937, and in December of 1937, a group of puppeteers from Duluth and the Twin Cities got together and started a chapter called the Northwest Puppetry Guild, which covered Minnesota and the adjoining states. The group was led by Del Wheeler of Duluth, who was a marionette artist, and the leadership structure skewed predominantly to Duluth. The Twin Cities offshoot of the organization was called the St. Paul chapter of the Northwest Puppetry Guild because that's where more members lived. And these members included some of the other puppeteers that we've talked about earlier, like Virginia Upson, like Deborah Meter in some association form. You can see member directories in the back that Kurt Hunter very kindly brought. And in 1939, they hosted a regional festival at the Commodore Hotel in St. Paul. And after, the Northwest Puppetry Guild's festival, the Twin Cities puppeteers decided that really they ought to have their own organization without these people from Duluth. So they split from the Northwest Puppetry Guild and founded their own organization, the Twin City Puppeteers. Yay! In the 1939 program, we have Deborah Meter performing. We also have Bob Longfield. also known as Andre Verne, and one of his puppets is in the back that you can see. He has been making puppets for about 10 years himself at this point, and here he is in about 1940 performing for children at the Sister Kenny Institute, so probably tuberculosis patients, with a delightful cow marionette. Anyway, the Twin City Puppeteers has now been officially incorporated as an organization, and this next year, they help to host the 5th Annual Puppeteers of America Conference in St. Paul at the Hotel Lowry. But we have to catch up on our framing device, because now it's 1940. Doesn't Bing Crosby look like he's having a great time? No, he doesn't. Anyway, you've almost certainly got a radio now. And there's so much on the radio. There's news, there's thrillers, there's music. The Fleischmann's Yeast Hour, that's out. Nobody listens to that anymore. There's so many things you could listen to. If you go to see a movie, there's now even color. Disney has released its first full-length color movie, Snow White, and they're about to release a second, Pinocchio. Gone with the Wind just came out, so did The Wizard of Oz. Comics have really taken off since last time we checked in. There's mainstream stuff. There's the Batman. There's the Superman. And comics, interestingly, aren't as gendered as they will come to be later. There are comics like Archie that are meant to appeal to sort of all children, not just boys, like superhero comics. There's also child labor laws now, so that's great. Your educational outlook is probably quite different. Odds are good that you will graduate from high school. The economy is doing better than it has in ages, but things are still a little bit shaky. The streetcar is still a very good way to get around. Very soon, there will be a lady driving it. Isn't that exciting? Why will there be a lady driving the streetcar? Oh, it's because of the war, which is about to happen. You're probably either vaguely aware of the war or very pointedly aware because it impacts your family. Because there is a large German-American population in Minnesota, there is a very significant movement within Minnesota to keep the U.S. out of the war. You may be worried about getting drafted if the war does happen. But you're not going to think about that now because the National Puppetry Conference is about to come to town. 500 puppetry professionals descending here at the Hotel Lowry. Isn't that exciting? You stop by and you see all the big puppetry names in your town. Virginia Upson, who we talked about earlier, isn't there. And that's a little bit odd because she's been a professional puppeteer for more than a decade now. In 1942, she made 2 very large marionettes. There aren't pictures of them, but the marionettes themselves are here, actually. They're in the back. There's a Paul Bunyan and a babe. Virginia performed less throughout the 40s and stopped performing almost entirely after she got married. The last show I could find is a public listing she did in 1949 of the Paul Bunyan show. So this is 1942, and then this is the 1949 listing that mentions the Paul Bunyan puppetry show that is happening here, and she's credited under her married name, Virginia Houdeling. She still stayed sort of involved with the puppetry community, especially much later in life when she returned to it. And also, Bob Longfield, who we saw earlier with his cow, was also increasingly active. He fought in the war, and his cow was also drafted into the war. They're here performing. And if you want to see a much narrower version of this picture, it's actually in the back, in the big Guild, Twin Cities Puppetry Guild scrapbook. So, see, same cow. Isn't that fun? You know who didn't know that? The Hennepin County Library. They didn't know who he was in the picture, so I went on and I found a little note saying, I know who he is. Here's more information. Anyway, like any good social historian, I went into this question looking for a single source or origin point and about where puppetry came from, and came to this answer. A variety of structural forces influence the community and its ability to continue into the present day. Now, is that a cop-out? You might think so, but I think it's actually much more interesting to consider that so many factors and people have helped create this community and continue its existence. So, what happened after 1940? How did we get to where we are today with all of these organizations? And what are puppetry organizations where you can go see a show today? Well, I have a pamphlet about it. It talks about the history that you heard here tonight. It also carries more of a through line to the present. It has a map of places you can go to for more information. You can also sign up on the mailing list that Kurt mentioned to get more information delivered directly to you. This is free with suggested donation. $10 will help me print another copy of it to sell. And it also has information about the oral history project that I did and some further sources and reading. And this is the end of my prepared remarks. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to talk more about the oral history component. But yeah.
So how did you get interested in this?
What a great question. Actually, I will skip ahead to so when I talk to puppeteers about how they got into puppetry and why, there are a variety of reasons. I am one of the relatively small number of people who became interested in puppetry as a child and just sort of stuck with it. When I became more involved in the community of puppeteers here, I started to wonder, oh, this is a large community, especially relative to the size. It's quite old and quite well established. I wonder where it came from. So in the lead up to the oral histories, I started asking people, and they said, well, I don't know specifically. I've only been involved for a little bit, but you should talk to someone else. And then they would say, oh, well, I don't really know. You should talk to Kurt Hunter specifically, actually. So as I talked to more and more people, they would go, well, I know when I started and I know what was happening then, but I don't really know where it actually came from. And now I've done this whole project about it. And I don't know either, so.
Is the Twin Cities unusual for the number of puppet organizations, or?
I would say it's unusual given the size of the Twin Cities. It's sort of a disproportionately large community based on the fact that we aren't one of the largest metro areas in the nation. And it's also unusual in that it isn't tied to a specific organization or institution in the same way. So there certainly have been longstanding and very influential organizations, but a lot of other communities sort of have a particular theater that served as the foundational anchor point and drew people to it, and then either it continues to this day or when that institution closed, those people stayed as a community. But the Twin Cities has been sort of interestingly decentralized.
Years ago, I had a puppet. It was a Charlie McCarthy puppet. And I was living in Montana at the time, and I had decided that I didn't really want Charlie McCarthy. So I created a cowgirl, and the cowgirl was named Yo-Yo. And Yo-Yo and Joni, me, were dressed alike. I found cowboy boots, the size to fit this huge puppet. And the puppet itself was about the size of a kindergartner. And so my mom was a teacher in elementary school, and so she would have me go different places. She says, go take a flight to Alaska and take some pictures and do stuff with Yo-Yo. And so I did that, and I even took pictures of the captain on the airplane holding Yo-Yo. And we went on dog sled rides and around, and I would take a gazillion pictures and come back home and go to my mom's school, and she would have the whole school come. But normally I just went to kindergarten places, and the kids would say to me, how come she gets to sit on your lap and I don't? And so I had to explain. But I had Yo-Yo, and we built an airplane for Yo-Yo. And at Christmas time, winter time, she would be dressed as Mrs. Santa Claus and would sit in the airplane and go to different schools, and we would sing holiday songs. But for one time after many years, I was really happy that I had her for many years. And I had some friends over for Christmas Day, and my friend had twin girls. One of the twins was a really sweet little girl, and the other one was not. And the one that was not took Yo-Yo, Mrs. Santa Claus at the time, took her head off and smashed it. And that was the death of Yo-Yo. Oh gosh, I was very sad. I did get another one, but it was never as popular as Yo-Yo. So that was fun for me.
You've already answered my question with one of your slides, but I'll ask it anyway. Is a ventriloquist dummy a puppet?
What an excellent question as well. I think based on the sort of loose construction that we've talked about here, I think I would say yes. But also I could say that no, it's just a little man who's alive. What do you mean a puppet? That's a real guy sitting there who's talking, and his big friend's just sitting there not doing anything.
According to Deborah's definition, a puppet has strings, so that would disqualify.
Well, there's also hand puppets back there that don't necessarily have.
So part two is a ventriloquist a puppeteer?
I guess it depends on whether you think their performance is animating or not.
How many hours did you spend researching this to put together this presentation, and what were some of your sources, particularly for finding the pictures?
Oh, Lord. I don't feel like I have a good answer for how many hours I spent on this. The activity book, or the pamphlet is the product of my master's degree in history. So many. But then following that, I would say, based on the sources that I initially pulled that I hadn't gotten a chance to dig deeper into here, probably another 15 or 20 hours to pull together this presentation and the photos. But very good question about the photos, and I tried to sort of credit them a little bit in the corners. But the Minnesota Digital Library has a very good collection of the park pageant photos. The Hennepin County Library also has the Park Board reports, which have additional photos. A number of the photos of Bob Longfield, for one, came from the Star Tribune collection at the Hennepin County Libraries as well. And then most of the WPA photos came from the Minnesota Historical Society. There is a part of why I know and was able to explain the sort of nesting structure of the WPA here is that I had to go through that structure in order to request photo negatives to be digitized and sent to me. So a number of the pictures used in this presentation and the pamphlet had not been developed as film, at least since the 30s, which was very funny because I actually ran into one of the librarians whose job it was to pull the photos. And he was like, "Oh, that was great that I got to look at those. That was really fascinating." And then a number of the newspaper pictures, particularly of Virginia Upson Houdeling, came from the Minnesota Historical Society's digital newspaper viewer. So you can put in names or terms and get see the digitized versions of the papers, and then of papers throughout Minnesota. There's also a separate viewer for just the Pioneer Press specifically to get a good look at those, and I think those are the main places the pictures came from.
Some of the puppets that I was exposed to when I was a child, mostly on TV, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, the Muppets, and Sesame Street. I'm wondering what is your take on those groups of puppets, and because they're kind of more recent examples of puppetry that I've been exposed to when I was a child.
Yeah, it's one of the things that there is, the areas that I did not explore as substantially was puppets on TV, especially puppets on TV in the cities. There were a number of local access television shows throughout the 70s and onwards that showed puppetry, but those, honestly, the part of why I didn't explore those as much is just the sourcing and the archives are quite different. It's very different to access a video media archive, and they are often much cagier about sharing things for research purposes and sharing things for display. So I think it's definitely something that I want to look into a little bit more. And it's impossible to talk about puppetry in the 20th century without sort of the profound influence of Jim Henson and the Muppets. And it's also interesting how a lot of what he did, he characterized as sort of a break from marionette forms of puppetry, and then a number of the puppeteers that I talked to for the Oral History Project sort of characterized their work and practice directly pushing back against conceptions of the Muppets, because much as now someone's default understanding of puppetry is probably the Muppets, in the 20s and 30s it was a hand puppet or a marionette. So it's interesting how that has also evolved and changed.
Hi, thank you for the amazing presentation. I thought that I would have asked all my questions and learned everything there is to learn about puppets from you already, but when I was watching, looking at the slides, I had a couple of questions about sort of the role of theater, like traditional theater, in relationship to the puppets historically. Sort of like two related questions. So the first is, you built this beautiful framing device of me as a child in the 20s and then the 30s and then the 40s, and whether or not I had or did not have radio and all these other things. Was there a thriving theater scene at the time? Was that something that came up? And also, would children have been seeing those shows, or did you not include that because it's children wouldn't be going to plays and things like that? And then also, we see here in this slide, a large portion of the folks who are interviewed got into puppetry by doing theater, and that wasn't a huge theme that came up in sort of the historical part. So was there not really an interplay between theater and puppetry in your historical research, or did that come up more?
Yeah, to the first part of your question, I think the parks pageants are interesting because they grow out of a sort of tradition of pageants and tableaus that would have been familiar to people in this era. One of the big sort of pieces of political protest art of, just before the framing device in the presentation was the National Women's Suffrage March, which one of the things that it featured was these tableaus of, sort of live tableaus of women's suffrage activists staged in ways that would evoke known images of the muses or the graces. And so I think the park pageantry is especially interesting because it sort of draws, it is a format that would have been familiar, the costume pageant, to people in the era, and but it is familiar to us in a different contextual way because we have a subsequent 100 years of puppetry, 50 years of Mayday, 30 years of Bare Bones, to sort of filter that through. But I think one of the through lines, by and large, at least for the WPA and also for the park pageants, was that both Deborah Meader and Alice Dietz did have or did sort of work to cultivate from existing organized theater infrastructure. Alice Dietz was a child actor and was familiar with theater because of that. So I think it's not necessarily always that puppetry has followed the, first you have theater and then you have puppetry. Virginia Upson didn't, at least from everything we've had to read, seem to have a substantial interest in theater before puppetry. But I think in order to exist and scale, there is the particular expertise that comes from engaging in theater at scale. And that is something as well that would have been reasonably common, just as now there would be an elementary school play, a high school play, a lot of short form plays would be distributed as, this is tactile or experiential learning.
Thank you so much for this presentation. My question is kind of surrounding place, in which you talk a lot about how these movements are sort of associated with a particular place, mostly a park or an organization that was in a specific area. I'm kind of curious, in some of those kind of earlier years, did you ever run into a place that seemed like it was forming a puppet community, but then sort of died out or didn't carry on that tradition? Or places that seem to have kind of an interest at some point, like something spiked their interest at a point and then just isn't a thing now?
Yes, Duluth. Duluth had, the reason that the leadership of the Northwest Puppetry Guild skewed to Duluth was because of the influence of people like Del Wheeler and other puppeteers who lived in Duluth, and that hasn't, there are still puppeteers in Duluth, but there's not a sort of critical organizational mass in the same way. And I haven't yet sort of looked at big comparative pieces in other cities, mostly because I needed to set some parameters on this so I could actually build sort of a substance of depth. But I think I would be interested to look more into why when the Twin Cities Puppetry Guild became its own organization, what happened in Duluth afterwards. And what I suspect from the sort of cursory research is that it was much more tied to the will and inertia of individuals. And when those individuals left or died or quit puppetry, there was not a sustaining community in the same way. Both in terms of it's just smaller and also, I think there is certainly something to the fact that the government paid people to make puppets here. And a lot of those people, one of the things that I didn't talk about as much in the sort of framework data is that, most of the people in the cities in the 20s, 30s, and 40s did not expect to leave, especially before World War II. And there was less sort of inflow to other cities. It was you stayed in one place and then you maybe moved once or maybe you died. I mean, probably you died eventually. And so it's interesting to track, what made this community survive when that one didn't. And I think, as with my other cop-out answer, there's a number of structural factors, but I think it is likely tied to the fact that Duluth was more the pet project of a number of particularly interested specific individuals, and there was not as much community buy-in to sustain pieces.
But this has really helped deepen our understanding of our history, hasn't it? It's really very nice. Thank you. And thank you so much to the Twin City Puppetry Group. Yeah, thank you.